Achtung, Feindkontakt. Verstanden?
Ja, Herr Kommandant.
October 14th, 1943, 11:00 a.m. Schweinfurt, Germany. The sky above the Bavarian city was a burning canvas of smoke trails and shattered aluminum. Hundreds of American B-17 flying fortresses had thundered across the morning horizon, their silver bodies glinting in the cold sun, their engines vibrating like a single heartbeat of defiance. Now, many of them were falling. One spiraled downward, wings sheared and bleeding fire. Another broke apart mid-air, scattering men and steel across the clouds. The sound was a brutal chorus, machine guns rattling engines, screaming explosions, tearing holes in the sky. Inside one of the remaining bombers, sweat froze on a gunner's face as he fired blind bursts into empty air. His comrades had already been ripped from the sky in minutes. In the distance, black crosses flashed across the wings of German fighters as they cut through the formation like hawks among exhausted prey. For the men inside those flying fortresses, the promise of invincibility, the myth that overlapping fields of machine gun fire could shield them, was unraveling in smoke and blood. Down below, German officers watched with cold satisfaction. To them it was a turkey shoot, a brutal arithmetic where American courage met German precision. To the Americans, it was something darker, a dawning realization that their strategy of daylight bombing was on the edge of collapse. This was Black Thursday, the day when the 8th Air Force bled so heavily that even its own commanders doubted the future of their mission. Yet what seemed like the height of German triumph concealed the seeds of their downfall. In less than 6 months, the skies over Germany would belong to someone else. The hunters would become the hunted. Black Thursday, the foretold tragedy. The morning sky over Schweinfurt still echoed with the images from the opening moment, and as the smoke drifted across the city, the true scale of the disaster began to take form. At dawn, 291 American B-17 flying fortresses had risen from English fields, engines roaring with the determination of a nation that believed in the myth of daylight precision bombing. Each bomber carried not just bombs, but the fragile confidence of a strategy built on the belief that mass formations could protect themselves. By mid-afternoon, that belief was being torn apart in flames. From the very first minutes inside German airspace, the bomber stream was marked and tracked. Jagged contrails appeared at high altitude, betraying the approach of the fortress fleet long before they reached their target. German radar had already set the trap, and Luftwaffe fighters were waiting fueled, armed, and guided to the kill zones. The Americans knew they would face opposition, but few expected the ferocity that fell upon them. FW 190 seconds and BF 109 seconds slashed through the formations like blades through cloth, diving head-on at a combined closing speed of over 600 miles per hour. To the gunners inside the bombers, the attack seemed like suicide charges, but the Germans knew exactly where to strike. Inside, the lead elements of the formation panic spread as the first bombers disintegrated. A B-17 named Mission Made took cannon shells to the cockpit, the nose breaking apart before the rest of the plane even had a chance to react. Another, the Lady Liberty, erupted in flames after its fuel tanks were punctured, exploding in a fireball so bright it seared the vision of crews nearby. Men watched helplessly as their comrades jumped from blazing fuselages, parachutes tangled or shredded by bullets before they could open. For those who survived the leap, German fighters often circled back, firing into helpless bodies drifting toward the ground. The slaughter unfolded with cold precision. The vaunted combat box formation, 18 to 20 bombers, interlocked to create overlapping fields of fire, was breaking down under coordinated assault. In theory, no angle of approach was left uncovered. In practice, the nose of the flying fortress was vulnerable. The arcs of fire left gaps that German pilots had mapped with mathematical detail. Major Heinz Noak's head-on attacks exploited those gaps with ruthless efficiency. Diving from 12 o'clock high, his bursts of fire aimed directly into cockpits and engines, tearing apart crews before defensive gunners could swing their weapons. The psychological weight was crushing. Inside the bombers, the constant hammer of 50 caliber guns filled the cabins with deafening vibration. Oxygen masks clung tight to faces as the altitude robbed men of breath, yet sweat pooled inside heavy jackets from the strain of survival. Shouted warnings, fighters at 3 o'clock, coming in fast, bled into chaos as tracers lit the air in every direction. A tail gunner from the 306th Bomb Group later wrote that he fired so many rounds his arms were numb, only to realize afterward that most of his bursts had hit nothing. The sky was alive with shadows, smoke, and sudden death. As the formation pressed toward Schweinfurt, the losses mounted. Engines coughed, black smoke wings trailed, fire fuselages split apart midair. 60 flying fortresses never returned to England that day. Another 17 limped home so damaged they were written off as irreparable. In one mission, the 8th Air Force lost nearly 25% of its attacking force. 600 American airmen were killed or captured in the span of hours. It was not just steel and fuel burning in the cold German sky. It was the very myth of the invincible bomber. For those who survived, the horror was etched in silence. Crews landed in England to empty bunks, mess halls, missing familiar voices, squadrons gutted in a single afternoon. Men who had once believed the fortress formations could fight their way through anything now sat in stunned quiet, staring at the empty spaces where their comrades should have been. The mission had technically hit its target, the ball-bearing factories of Schweinfurt, but at a cost so staggering it nearly ended the daylight bombing campaign altogether. The Luftwaffe, watching from the ground and celebrating in the air, called it a turkey shoot. They saw the bombers as helpless prey, lumbering targets without protection. For the Americans, the day was remembered forever as Black Thursday, a day of reckoning that cut through arrogance with blood and fire. And yet, beneath the smoke of destruction, a truth lingered. This tragedy was not random. It was the product of an arithmetic the Germans had perfected. Escorts could not yet follow the bombers deep into the Reich. The fortresses were left alone, exposed, and the Luftwaffe exploited the gap with ruthless discipline. If Black Thursday was a tragedy, it was also a warning, one written in flames over Schweinfurt. For the men of the 8th Air Force, the question was now unavoidable. Could the war in the air be won at all without a weapon that could change the balance? The answer was coming. If October 1943 revealed American vulnerability, the months ahead would reveal something else entirely. Because if Black Thursday was tragedy, its cause lay not in American weakness alone, but in the absolute advantage of the Luftwaffe. A golden moment for Germany that would soon be tested and broken by a machine built to end their dominance. If Black Thursday revealed the terrible cost of unescorted bombers, it also exposed with cruel clarity why the Luftwaffe held such an overwhelming advantage in late 1943. The men who flew for the 8th Air Force understood it. As they counted the empty bunks and silent mess halls, the B-17 seconds and B-24 seconds could be built by the hundreds, but without long-range protection, every mission into Germany was a gamble against impossible odds. The Germans knew this arithmetic intimately, and they had shaped their entire strategy around it. The American escort fighters available in 1943 were hobbled by the simplest limitation of all range. The Republic P-47 Thunderbolt was a beast of an aircraft, rugged and heavily armed, a truck in the sky that could dive like a stone and climb back again. But even with external drop tanks, its combat radius barely reached 375 miles. That was enough to see the bombers to the edges of Germany, but no further. Once the P-47 seconds peeled away to refuel the bombers, still had hundreds of miles to travel deeper into the Reich, into the heartland of German industry, where ball bearings, oil, and aircraft rolled from the factories. It was in those unprotected hours that the Luftwaffe struck with a precision born from practice. The P-38 Lightning had been hailed as a possible answer. Twin-engined, sleek, and faster than the Thunderbolt, at certain altitudes the Lightning could fly farther. Yet in the bitter cold of northern Europe, its engines failed with disturbing frequency. Its controls stiffened at high altitude, and its pilots found themselves fighting the machine as often as the enemy. Mechanical troubles turned potential strength into liability, and so the P-38 could not provide the shield the bombers so desperately needed. The Luftwaffe's advantage was not merely technical, it was tactical, psychological, and logistical all at once. German radar tracked the bomber streams as soon as they crossed the channel. Controllers directed their squadrons with ruthless efficiency, calculating exactly where the American escorts would turn back. The Luftwaffe had even coined a phrase for it, the golden moment. It was the point when the little friends disappeared, when the bombers suddenly found themselves alone, when every gunner's breath grew tighter inside his oxygen mask. At that moment, the fighters came. They came in formations of their own, not chaotic, but orchestrated like a storm. Major Walter Dahl, Major Wilhelm Ferdinand Galland, and other aces had perfected methods that turned the weaknesses of the bomber combat box into death traps. Heinz Nock pioneered the head-on attack, diving from 12 o'clock high directly at the nose of the bombers. At closing speeds of 600 miles per hour, gunners had only seconds to react, and often they failed. Even when they did manage to return fire, the German pilots only needed 2 seconds of cannon bursts to rip open a cockpit or shatter an engine. One pass, one kill. Other squadrons developed the company front attack, sending 8 or more FW-192s wing to wing against the bomber boxes. To the Americans watching from inside their fortresses, the sight was nightmarish, an entire wall of fighters sweeping down upon them, guns blazing, saturating the air with targets. The gunners often froze, unable to pick which attacker to fire, at wasting precious ammunition on empty sky. Panic was as deadly as cannon shells, and the Luftwaffe understood that fear was a weapon. The advantage extended beyond the first strike. German airfields lay dotted across the Reich close to the lines of approach, and Luftwaffe pilots could land, refuel, rearm, and return to the same raid multiple times. Some flew 3 or even 4 sorties in a single day, hammering the same bomber group again and again. American crews trapped for hours on end in their vulnerable formations faced a relentless cycle of attack that seemed without end. Each time they thought they had shaken, the hunters, more appeared. For the men in the fortresses, exhaustion became as dangerous as enemy fire. Oberleutnant Hans Philipp, one of the Luftwaffe's most lethal pilots, with over 200 victories before his death in October 1943, explained it bluntly. "We waited until the escorts left. Then we pounced. Always we pounced." To the bomber crews, it felt like flying into a predator's den, knowing that the moment of abandonment was coming. They could almost sense it the moment when the thunderbolts banked away, leaving the heavy bombers to tighten their formation and brace for the inevitable. The psychological toll was staggering. American airmen began to call it coffin corner, the long stretch of sky where they were utterly alone. They tightened their formations, checked and rechecked their guns, but every man knew the truth. Against coordinated attacks, the fortresses were not fortresses at all, but steel coffins waiting to be opened. It was not just the physical losses, though those were immense, but the creeping realization that daylight bombing, the very cornerstone of American strategy in Europe, might be unsustainable. Every mission risked hundreds of men and dozens of planes, and each return to base left commanders staring at casualty lists that threatened to cripple the 8th Air Force before the campaign had even truly begun. And yet, from the German perspective, this was the apex of their dominance. The golden moment was theirs, and they wielded it with brutal confidence. American formations were predictable. Their escorts limited, their tactics known. For every pilot in a B-17, the odds felt hopeless. For every Luftwaffe ace, the hunt seemed endless. But history has a way of turning triumph into illusion. Even as the Luftwaffe reveled in its mastery, deep within Allied factories and airfields, a new weapon was preparing to take flight. It would erase the golden moment entirely, stretch its wings across the skies of Europe, and escort the bombers into the very heart of the Reich. For now, though, in late 1943, Germany's advantage was absolute. And for the Americans, the nightmare of Schweinfurt and the slaughter of Black Thursday left one inescapable conclusion. Unless they found a fighter that could fly with the bombers all the way to the target and back, their strategy would collapse. The hunt for that fighter had already begun. The golden moment of the Luftwaffe had been forged out of the American weakness, described before the inability of their escorts to fly deep into Germany. It was this simple arithmetic. this cruel geometry of range and endurance that gave German pilots such ruthless confidence. But as the bomber crews buried their dead, after Schweinfurt engineers, commanders, and political leaders knew the solution could not come from courage alone. America needed a weapon that did not yet exist, a fighter with the legs to reach Berlin and back, and the claws to tear into the Luftwaffe on equal terms. Out of desperation and innovation, that weapon was born. The story began not in Washington, but in London. In April 1940, with Britain reeling from the fall of France and staring down the prospect of standing alone against Hitler, the British Purchasing Commission approached North American aviation. They needed more fighters fast, and initially requested that North American simply build Curtiss P-40 Warhawks under license. It would have been easy money copy an existing design, deliver the planes, and collect the contract. But North American's president, James H. Dutch Kindleberger, made a bold offer. Instead of building outdated P-42s, his team would design an entirely new fighter, faster, sleeker, more advanced, and they would do it in just 120 days. It sounded impossible, but the gamble was accepted. The result was the NA-73X prototype, the first Mustang. When it flew on the 26th of October 1940, it shocked observers. The airframe was revolutionary, designed with a laminar flow wing that reduced drag by nearly a third compared to conventional fighters. It handled beautifully, at low altitude, stable, fast, agile. The British were intrigued, but there was a problem. Powered by the American Ellison V-1710 engine, the Mustang gasped for breath above 15,000 feet. It was excellent for reconnaissance and ground attack, but useless in the high-altitude realm where bombers flew and air superiority was decided. At first, it seemed destined to remain a footnote, a clever design hobbled by its power plant. But in April 1942, everything changed. Ronald Harker, a Rolls-Royce test pilot, flew an Allison-powered Mustang and instantly recognized its hidden potential. The airframe, he said, was better than anything in the sky, cleaner than a Spitfire, sleeker than a Hurricane. What it needed was a new heart. He proposed replacing the Allison with a Rolls-Royce Merlin 61, the same supercharged engine that had transformed the Spitfire into a legend. It was a marriage of necessity and brilliance. American design meeting British engineering. When the first Merlin-powered Mustangs took flight in late 1942, the transformation was staggering. Speed leapt from 390 to 440 miles per hour. Performance above 2,000 feet. Once dismal became exceptional. The service ceiling soared from 3,1000 to 4,2000 feet. Suddenly, the Mustang could not only fly with the bombers, it could fight the Luftwaffe on even ground. But what truly made the P-51 revolutionary was not just its performance, it was its range. The Mustang's laminar flow wing gave it efficiency no other fighter could match. While the P-47 devoured 100 gallons of fuel per hour, the Mustang sipped just 65. Its lighter airframe allowed more endurance from less fuel, and with external drop tanks, first 75-gallon, then 108-gallon, the Mustang's combat radius stretched farther and farther. By March 1944, it could fly 850 miles, escort bombers to Berlin, loiter over the target dogfight German fighters, and still make it home to England. No other single-engine fighter in the world could claim such reach. For the men who first touched its controls, the difference was immediate and visceral. Lieutenant Colonel Glenn Duncan, accustomed to the heavy Thunderbolt, described his first flight in a Mustang as trading a truck for a sports car. It was responsive, sharp, alive in his hands. Colonel Don Blakesley, who would lead Mustangs over Berlin, summed it up in simple words. The moment I lifted off, I knew we had something special. The Pioneer Mustang Group, the 354th Fighter Group, received the first P-51Bs in November 1943. Based in Essex, they were still technically under the 9th Air Force, but their mission was clear: to escort the bombers of the 8th Air Force. The first sorties were tentative short-range sweeps into Belgium and France. At first, the Germans hardly noticed mistaking the new silhouette for Thunderbolts at long range. They assumed, as always, that the escorts would turn back. But then December came. On the 13th of December 1943, Mustangs flew their first long-range escort to Kiel, nearly 500 miles from base range. Previously unimaginable. German pilots expecting lonely bombers were stunned to find fresh aggressive American fighters waiting deep inside Reich territory. Radio intercepts recorded the confusion. German controllers asked repeatedly if their pilots were certain of what they were seeing. Are you sure they are still with the bombers? Are you sure they are not Thunderbolts? The answer came with panic in the voices. They are still with them. They are Mustangs. In those first encounters, the Luftwaffe's dominance cracked. The golden moment, their sacred window of unopposed attack, had been erased. Now, even as escorts peeled away at the limits of their endurance, the Mustangs remained diving into German formations, chasing fighters back to their own airfields. The hunters were no longer secure. For the Americans, hope surged. The bombers still took losses, but now they were not abandoned. Mustangs hovered overhead, weaving in protective arcs, diving to intercept attackers before they could close. The psychological shift was immense. Where once crews had braced for hours of helpless terror, now they felt the presence of guardians nimble and fierce, willing to fight for them. The P-51 Mustang was more than a machine. It was proof of Allied ingenuity, the embodiment of cooperation between nations. American factories could produce thousands. British engineering had given it the Merlin's beating heart. Together they had created something greater than either could alone. It was not simply another fighter. It was the weapon that turned strategy into possibility. And yet, as December faded into the harsh winter of 1944, the Mustang's true power was only beginning to reveal itself. The Luftwaffe still believed in some corners that this was a passing threat, a trick of range and luck. They had not yet seen the full scale of what was coming, because the true strength of the Mustang was not proven in tests or in short-range missions. Its destiny lay deeper beyond the Rhine, above the capital of the Reich itself. The moment would come when hundreds of bombers streamed toward Berlin, and the Luftwaffe, rising to intercept, would look up in disbelief. For on that day, the skies above Germany's heart would no longer belong to them. The Mustangs would be there, engines snarling guns, loaded ready to hunt. And in that moment, the legend would be written. Because the Mustang was born to do more than fly. It was born to change the war. But its true power, its undeniable legacy, would only be revealed when it appeared over Berlin. The transformation that began with the arrival of the Merlin Mustang reached its dramatic climax in March 1944. For months, the Luftwaffe had been adjusting uneasily to the realization that the new American fighter could stay longer and fight harder than anything they had ever faced. But disbelief still lingered. Many German commanders reassured themselves that the bombers could never truly be escorted all the way into the Reich's inner sanctum. Berlin, they insisted, was untouchable. It was the heart of the Reich, defended not only by flak and concrete, but by distance itself. No single-engine fighter could fly there, protect bombers, engage in combat, and return. That was the shield they trusted. On March 4th, 1944, that shield was shattered. The morning began with a sight few Berliners had ever imagined. Rising over the horizon, wave after wave of American bombers, 660 B-17 flying fortresses thundered toward the capital. Their contrails streaked the sky in endless white ribbons, their formations so vast they seemed to stretch from one horizon to the other. For the people in the city below, air raid sirens howled and civilians fled to shelters. For the Luftwaffe, this was the ultimate test. They scrambled more than 200 fighters to intercept, confident that once again, as had always been the case, the bombers would be alone when they reached the city's edge. But this time, the formations were not alone. Out of the pale winter light weaving above and alongside the bombers came scores of P-51 Mustangs. Their long noses and shark-like profiles marked them instantly as something new, something terrifying. German controllers at first refused to believe their own pilots' reports. "Identify again," they demanded over the radio. "Are you certain?" The replies came with disbelief and panic. "They are Mustangs. They are still with the bombers." For the Luftwaffe aces, climbing to intercept the site was incomprehensible. They had been told the Americans could never escort bombers this far. They had built their confidence on that promise. Yet here they were, American fighters, fresh and eager, after escorting the bombers across hundreds of miles, now circling for the kill above the very capital of the Reich. The hunters had just become the hunted. Reichsmarschall Hermann Göring himself was confronted with proof. Gun camera footage, combat reports, eyewitnesses all left no doubt. Göring, who had once boasted that no enemy aircraft would ever reach Berlin, reportedly admitted with bitterness, "When I saw Mustangs over Berlin, I knew the war was lost." Whether apocryphal or not, the sentiment captured the truth. The Luftwaffe's sanctuary had vanished. The combat that followed was savage. More than 200 German fighters dove into the bomber streams, expecting once again to carve them apart. Instead, they found swarms of Mustangs diving from above, cutting into their formations, scattering them before they could even line up their shots. The Americans fought with altitude advantage, speed, and endurance. German pilots, who once relished the freedom to attack bombers unopposed, now found themselves outnumbered, outclimbed, and outmaneuvered. Captain Donald Gentile of the 4th Fighter Group, one of the rising Mustang aces, described it as a revelation. "The Mustang gave us everything we dreamed of: speed to catch them, agility to fight them, range to follow them anywhere." That day, his squadron claimed multiple victories, breaking up German attacks before they ever reached the bombers. The bombers, for once, could see their escorts not peeling away to the west, but diving into enemy fighters above Berlin itself. The psychological shift was immediate. Men who had braced for helpless hours of slaughter now watched Mustangs streak past their windows, tearing into the enemy. For the Germans, the shift was catastrophic. Pilots who had once stalked the bombers like wolves suddenly found themselves preyed upon. The Mustangs pursued them even as they tried to disengage, following them down toward their airfields, pressing the fight into the very airspace the Luftwaffe had believed inviolate. One German ace, Major Klaus Miatusch of JG-26, after surviving an encounter, confessed to his men, "The air war has changed. Our sanctuary no longer exists." The symbolic power of that day cannot be overstated. For the first time, the American 8th Air Force had struck at Berlin in daylight with massive force, and for the first time the bombers had been protected all the way. The Luftwaffe's strategy, built entirely on the absence of long-range escorts, collapsed in an instant. Every pilot in the Reich understood the meaning. If the Mustangs could reach Berlin, they could reach anywhere. Aircraft factories in Bavaria, oil refineries in Silesia, rail yards in Munich, all were now within reach of not just bombers, but of relentless escorts who would sweep the skies clear ahead of them. The Luftwaffe could no longer dictate the terms of battle. The Americans could bring the fight to their doorstep at any time, with overwhelming numbers. Letters written by German pilots in the weeks after March 4th reveal the despair that spread through their ranks. One wrote, "We looked up and saw them Mustangs circling above our capital. At that moment we knew. It was no longer our sky." Another described the sensation of taking off already, knowing the enemy would be waiting at higher altitude, fresher, with more fuel. It was a fatalism, born not from one defeat, but from the collapse of a system of belief. For the Americans, that day was more than victory. It was vindication. The months of horror at Schweinfurt, the losses of Black Thursday, the doubt about daylight bombing, all seemed to dissolve as the Mustangs escorted their charges into Berlin and back again. The price was still high, the missions still dangerous, but now the equation had changed. The Luftwaffe was no longer the predator in the skies. From March 1944 onward, the balance was irreversible. The golden moment of the Luftwaffe was gone forever. The very weapon that had given them dominance, the certainty that escorts would always turn back, had been destroyed by the Mustang. In its place came a new reality: relentless pursuit, Allied superiority, and the steady erosion of Germany's last defense. The hunters had become the hunted, and the sky over Berlin had told the world that the tide had turned. From that moment on, the balance of air power was tipped decisively. The Reich's fate was sealed not just on the ground but in the air, and it was sealed by the long wings of the P-51 Mustang. From then forward, the balance of the skies no longer belonged to Germany. The scale had shifted permanently in favor of the Allies. The sight of Mustangs escorting bombers into Berlin had been more than a tactical shock. It was a revelation. A moment that stripped away every illusion the Luftwaffe had built its confidence upon. For the first time since the war began, German pilots were forced to confront a reality they had long denied: the Reich no longer controlled its skies. And the nightmare was only beginning. What had been exposed on March 4, 1944 would be driven home with merciless precision in the weeks and months that followed. The hunters once so feared were about to face their own destruction. The turning point came in February 1944 during a campaign that the Americans named Operation Argument, but that history remembers simply as Big Week. Between February 20th and 25th, the 8th Air Force launched a relentless series of raids against German aircraft production. Day after day, wave after wave of bombers crossed into Reich territory, now escorted by swarms of Mustangs, determined not only to protect the bombers, but to seek out combat to bleed the Luftwaffe dry. The results were devastating. In just 6 days, the Americans flew 3 300 bomber sorties and 3 673 fighter sorties. They lost 226 bombers, a terrible price, but the Luftwaffe lost more than 500 aircraft, and with them something far more irreplaceable: their veteran pilots. These were the men who had survived years of combat, the aces who had carved their names into the scoreboards of the Reich. Their deaths could not be undone, and their experience could not be replaced. For every German ace lost a new recruit, with barely 50 hours of training, was thrown into the cockpit. Against American pilots arriving in Europe with 300 to 400 hours of flight time, the imbalance was catastrophic. And even for those German pilots who survived Big Week, a new terror awaited them: fuel. By spring 1944, American bombers and Mustangs were not only destroying aircraft factories, but targeting the synthetic oil plants that fed the Luftwaffe. Facilities at Leopolditz and Brooks were pounded until their production collapsed. In April 1944, German aviation fuel output was 17,500 tons. By July, it had fallen to 3,000. By September, a mere 1,000. Without fuel, planes were grounded, training flights canceled, and entire squadrons reduced to a handful of sorties. Veterans like Oberst Johannes Steinhoff watched in despair as the most advanced fighters in the world, the Me-262 jet and the rocket-powered Me-163 Comet, sat idle for lack of fuel. "We had the world's first operational jets," he recalled bitterly, "but we could barely fly them." What good was a technological miracle when it could not leave the runway? Meanwhile, Mustangs roamed freely above circling German bases, waiting to pounce on anything that dared to take off. By the summer of 1944,